Welcome to another A-Level EdXL Paper 4 GCE Religious Studies uh, video. This video will be looking at the acts of the Buddha 7 and 8. So that's his victory over Mara and his enlightenment. The key here is knowing not just the events, but the significance and meaning of these two events, in particular to the two great groups of Buddhists, the Theravada and the Mahayana Buddhists. Now, before we go into this week's work, you need to consider these two people. These are the two named scholars on the EdXL Unit 2.1 paper on the life of the Buddha. So Bhikkhu Namoli, first of all. This guy was a English guy who, during the Second World War, was posted in Italy. He's interesting. He was in charge of interrogating spies and all that sort of stuff. So a bit of a James Bond. And while he was there, he read this sort of interpretation of Buddhism by a sort of Nietzschean scholar, and he got attracted to Buddhism. And after the war, he decided to head out to Sri Lanka. He'd spent some time with the BBC, and then decided he'd had enough, and he headed out to Sri Lanka to join this island monastery, and there he learnt Pali from quite a famous bhikkhu or monk there in Sri Lanka. And during his time, he became an adept scholar at translating the Pali, first translating this very significant Buddhist text, the Vishuddhimagga, and then most importantly for us, his text, The Life of the Buddha, in 1972, which is really just a compendium of Pali, the earliest perhaps written evidence for the Buddha around, and he tries to reconstruct a life of the Buddha from just the Pali text. So this isn't just an interpretation of Ashvaghosha's text or any of his later biographies. It's a collection of all the things that are in, or many of the things that are in the Pali text. The second key author is Karen Armstrong. Karen has written a copious number of books from a mystical perspective. Her background is as a commentator known for books on comparative religion. She was a Catholic, in fact, and former nun, and she went from this sort of Catholic conservative faith to much more liberal and mystical Christian faith, and very much embracing ideas like big history, axial age thinking, and very interested in Buddhist teachings on compassion, spirituality, the golden rule. That's her thing, and that's her interpretation of Buddhism. It's quite important to know that. Now, from each of these scholars, you need to know a few things they might have said. Here's some of the things that Armstrong has said about some of the acts of the Buddha, at least the early acts of the Buddha. From his conception, salvation doesn't lie in animal sacrifices, the Brahmins had taught, but in the spiritual realization that Brahman is the absolute eternal reality that's higher even than the gods, almost identical to one's deepest self or Atman. So Armstrong identifying the move from Brahmanism to Buddhism and the sort of philosophy behind it. In terms of the acts, his physical birth, Armstrong says rebirth in one of the heavens was not a happy ending because the divinity was no more permanent than the other state. Interesting. Even a god would exhaust the good karma which had divinized him. He would then die and be reborn in a less advantageous position on earth. And not so much the possibility of rebirth as the horror of re-death. Now, pause there. Here we have a little bit of confusion, I think, in Armstrong. At times she speaks as a Mahayana Buddhist, and other times as a Theravada Buddhist. Accomplishment and worldly skills. There's a deep affinity between the earth and the selfless human being, something that Gautama had sensed when they were called in a trance under the rose apple tree. Her commentary here on the early life of the Buddha, read through her reading of This would have been the Sutta Pitaka, and in particular the Jataka tale that tells about the Buddha reflecting on his early life. People then turn to other methods of transcending the sufferings and frustrations of daily life, to art, music, sex, drugs, sport, philosophy. We are beings who fall easily into despair, and we have to work very hard to create within ourselves a conviction that life is good, even though all around us we see pain, cruelty, sickness, and injustice. Another quote from her, reflecting on this common spiritual yearning she thinks we all have, her deep sense of spirituality. She, commenting on the Buddha, talks about a miasma of petty tasks, pointless duties that sullied everything. She thinks that applies to the Buddha, but probably to us as well. His father's house was not dirty, but it was filled with people who pulled at his heart with objects that he treasured. If he wanted to live in holiness, he had to cut these fetters and break free. Dust, dirtiness is a phrase that is used in some of the texts to refer to things that keep us down, as it were. And she rightly picks up on some of that. For his youth, a life of pleasure and indulgence, Gautama's pleasure palace is a striking image of the mind in denial. Great comment there. Pretty accurate, I think, reflection of Buddhist teaching that the pleasure palace, sounds like Brighton or somewhere in the north of England, a striking image of the mind in denial. That strikes me as a bit Theravadan, interesting. Called a little boy Rahula, or fetter, the baby he believed would shackle him to a way of life that had become abhorrent. As here we find her comment that Rahula, at this point, the birth of his baby, he already is feeling his disillusionment with the pleasure palace. Impede enlightenment, since it traps a person in a self which is inauthentic and infantile, unawakened state. So lots of things impede enlightenment. To seek happiness in mortal transitory things not only is irrational, but the suffering in store for his loved ones, as well as himself, cast a dark shadow over the present and took away all his joy in these relationships. Her comment on his pleasure and indulgence, taking away his joy and happiness. So he leaves the palace, Acts number 5, quoting Dominic Side here. Human beings are the only animals who have to live with the knowledge they will die one day, and they have always found this vision of extinction difficult to contemplate. Again, this is Armstrong talking herself. The gods could give the Bodhisattva a much-needed nudge. Interesting use of this term, Bodhisattva. Is it a Theravada or a Mahayana term? Well, it can be both, but it's more likely to be a Mahayana term, and you need to be a little bit careful about the way you use it. I'm not sure Armstrong always is. Life seems meaningless. An Axel age pioneer, there's her great phrase, it comes from a big history idea, will feel compelled to break out of the old accepted patterns and find a new way of coping with this pain. Life is an ascetic, so his great going forth, as it's called, from the Father's house is said in the Pali Canon to have happened to one of Gautama's predecessors, Buddha Vipassi. The scriptures were not interested in tracing Gautama's unique personal achievement, but in setting forth the path of all Buddhas. Wow, this is very much a Mahayana interpretation, and a bit of a put down in Theravada, I think. What do you think? It's a romantic decision, but it caused great pain to the people he loved. Again, this is just her view. Whether or not it was a romantic decision, could have been a perfectly rational decision. Who knows? Why this rejectionism? The Pali Canon gave a starker version of the young man's decision. When he looked at human life, Gautama could only see a grim cycle of suffering, which began with the trauma of birth, and proceeded inexorably to the aging, illness, death, sorrow, and corruption. So those are sort of things that Armstrong says about the early life of the Buddha. What about Nanamoli? Now, I hope you've done this in class. Read the first couple of chapters and see how you get on. Find a single quote, as it were, for each of the things that he says. Great to listen along. Listen again for another video.